Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Sadina Isaacs, and I will be your guest speaker today. We are going to look at the fluid and electrolyte needs for exercise, particularly examining the most recent guidelines provided by the ACSM and AND. Here's a brief outline of my presentation today. We are going to look at the DRIs for total water intake, intra and extracellular body water, the regulation of body temperature during exercise and dehydration, and how to monitor hydration status, the 2016 ACSM and AND guidelines for pre, during, and post-exercise hydration, gastric emptying and the intestinal absorption of fluids, and lastly, some practical guidelines for staying hydrated during exercise. Current recommendations for water intake provided by the Institute of Medicine dietary reference intakes are provided as adequate intakes. The reason that we have an adequate intake and not an RDA or an EAR is because individual fluid needs vary. Males greater than 19 years or older should consume 3.7 liters per day, whereas females should consume about 2.7 liters per day. Regardless of gender, beverages will generally meet about 80% of fluid needs, whereas foods provide the remaining 20%. Body water constitutes approximately 60% of total body weight, and intracellular fluid makes up 67% of total body water, or the water that is inside cells. The remaining 33% is extracellular, or water that's outside of the cells, and this includes the lymph, the blood, and the plasma. There are also some notable differences in body water by gender and by adiposity. Males are comprised of about 60% water, whereas females are about 50% water. On the other hand, lean individuals are about 70% water and obese individuals are about 40% water. These differences are due to the overall percentage of lean muscle mass or lean tissue by gender and by adiposity. Males have a larger percentage of lean muscle mass compared to females, and lean individuals have a larger overall lean tissue compared to obese individuals. I'd like to also review with you some of the avenues of water loss. Urination is the main avenue of loss during resting conditions and can be influenced by consumption of caffeine and alcohol. For every milligram of caffeine consumed, about a milliliter of fluid is lost, and for every gram of alcohol consumed, about 10 milliliters of fluid is lost. I will point out that caffeine may not influence some individuals like it does others, particularly for those who are adept at consuming larger amounts of it. Diuretic medications and high-protein diets, furthermore, can increase urinary losses of water. Defecation and exhalation through breathing are some other primary avenues of loss, whilst insensible perspiration and sweating accounts for about 30% of total body loss. And this is going to be the major avenue of loss during exercise, as the body produces larger amounts of sweat to help with cooling. So we've reviewed briefly the adequate intakes for water consumption and the primary avenues of water loss. And the goal here is to maintain overall water balance so that the approximate intake is equal to the approximate output every day. Water and electrolyte balance are absolutely critical during exercise because fluid shifts between compartments can drastically affect performance. For instance, decreased blood volume or decreased cellular volume are likely to occur during hot and humid conditions. And these both can drastically contribute to fatigue, which ultimately influences performance. Normal kidney function is very effective at helping to regulate body water. And I want to give you an example here of how that is done during an exercise event. So the stimulus here would be excessive sweat losses. And this comes from extracellular fluid going to the surface of the skin in order to help cool the skin and dissipate some of that heat. That extracellular fluid loss contributes to an overall loss of total fluid in the blood. And as a result, the blood becomes hypertonic. That hypertonic blood then is sensed by osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which stimulate the pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone into circulation. Antidiuretic hormone goes to the kidneys where it stimulates the kidneys to increase the absorption of water, and that water then is returned into the blood to help increase the blood volume and to help maintain overall body water. A couple of slides back, I mentioned that perspiration is one of the main avenues of water loss, particularly during exercise events. And the reason for that is because perspiration serves as one of the primary regulations of body temperature. So our body temperature is regulated by the hypothalamus, which is often termed the thermostat, because one of its functions is to maintain the core temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. And during exercise, we have multiple heat stresses in addition to the metabolic heat production just from the exercise. There may be solar radiation, as well as the hot air and relative humidity, as well as just general ground heat that's reflecting up onto the athlete. Now we have other avenues of heat loss in addition to sweat evaporation, and that's including the respiratory evaluation, that's where we're also having some fluid losses. Radiation of heat from the body is another way of getting rid of some of that heat. And then also just convection from wind currents helps to pass over the skin and cool it. I want to note that exercise does increase the metabolism significantly, and about 75 or 80% of that energy produced is released as heat. And therefore, these multiple methods of regulating body temperature and heat loss are absolutely critical for maintaining that core temperature around 37 degrees Celsius. Hyperthermia is much more common than hypothermia because of these excessive stressors that significantly increase body temperature with exercise. Factors that influence sweat production include the air temperature. This is particularly notable when exercising in air temperatures be above 80 degrees Fahrenheit or above relative humidities of about 50 to 60%. And that is because with the relative humidity increasing, the water is not able to evaporate from the skin as quickly, and the cooling effect is significantly diminished. Air movement also influences sweat production, so if air movement is limited, heat can't be carried away from the body as effectively. And radiation heat from the sun can also create an additional heat load, which further increases that sweat production. The heat index indicator of heat stress is an excellent tool that can be used to really assess the overall risk of exercising in certain humidity and temperatures. It combines both air temperature with relative humidity to give an overall risk of exercising in that temperature and humidity. So for instance, looking at this heat index indicator of heat stress graph, we can see that at around 80 to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, right here, 80 to 88, 89, with the humidity around that 40 to 45%. Caution should be used, and because fatigue is very likely with exercise at a temperature that high. In hot environmental conditions, athletes may lose up to 3 to 4 liters of sweat per hour. That's the equivalent of 6.5 to 9 pounds every hour. And this is really staggering when we think that many athletes are exercising beyond 60 minutes. So there's a really high risk for continuing to lose excessive amounts of fluids the longer that the exercise continues. On average, in hot environmental conditions and with strenuous exercise, most will lose about 2 to 3 liters per hour. Now, if that 2 liters of sweat is lost or 2 kilograms of body weight, this can significantly influence fatigue, which then overall influences performance as well. Now, there are differences that should be noted in sweat production between males and females and between children and adults. Males produce more sweat than females and therefore are more efficient at cooling than females are. And as a whole, adults will also produce more sweat than children do. Therefore, adults are more efficient at cooling than children. Now, composition of sweat is composed primarily of sodium, but there's also other electrolytes in smaller amounts, including chloride, potassium, iron, calcium, zinc, magnesium, and copper. On average, the sodium content of sweat is about 3.2 grams per liter. There are many notable physiological effects of dehydration that I think are depicted pretty well in this graph here. There's going to be an overall decreased plasma volume relative to the excessive sweating. And that excessive sweating then increases plasma osmolality and blood viscosity and ultimately decreases the total central blood volume. Now, the heart rate increases, however, because of a decreased blood volume, it's unable to offset decreases in diastolic filling and stroke volume. This results in an overall decreased cardiac output, and the delivery of oxygen to muscles and blood flow to muscles is also diminished. This means that the blood flow to the skin is decreased and the sweat rate will decline because the skin isn't able to get the blood flow that it's necessary. As a result, the core body temperature increases. So there's an overall low blood volume contributes to increased core temperature, and collectively these contribute to premature fatigue and heat illness. I want to show you this graph that looks at the percent body loss. Over here on the left we see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's percent body loss. And with each percentage increase in body water loss or body weight loss, we can see incremental decreases in performance and function and overall physiological consequences relative to dehydration. Now, I want to point out that performance can already be impaired at 1% dehydration. So we notice that there's discomfort, lower concentration, an overall decreased mental capacity and physical decrement to being able to do the work, even at just a 1% dehydration. What's notable is that the thirst mechanism really doesn't kick in until that 1% dehydration, and at that point they're already noticing physical decrements. Now, the other interesting thing is that the urinary production or urinary output doesn't begin to decline until you've reached 3% body weight loss, which is very, very significant. And so by the time that 3% decrease comes along, the athlete or the individual exercising can be very significantly dehydrated. This graph is from a study that looked at the decline in performance based on measurements of power output and work done to exhaustion using an intense workload. And the exercise was performed at various levels of dehydration to see how physical performance stood up to the test. And the thing that I think is most notable here is that at 1% dehydration, just 1% right here, overall physical performance was already decreased 5% at just a 1% dehydration. And so we can see incrementally that performance continues to decline in larger and larger amounts with each % increase in dehydration. So one way that we can individualize hydration practices in order to prevent dehydration is to calculate sweat rate. And by doing so, we know exactly how much the individual is losing during a certain environmental condition. And by knowing the amount lost, we're better able to adjust for how much needs to be repleted. So in order to calculate a sweat rate, you're going to assess weight before and after exercise to get the net change. Measure the liquids consumed during the exercise, and then the overall urine volume excreted as well. And on the next slide, I have a sample for you that you can practice actually calculating a sweat rate. So here I've provided you two different athletes in order to calculate sweat rate. So it's two different scenarios. Athlete A is in metric units and athlete B is in imperial units. I will point out that these are two different athletes, two different scenarios. They're not just converted to a different unit. So you can practice doing either one that you would like. For this particular example, I'm just going to use athlete A because I think the metric system is a little bit easier to use for this. So we're going to first of all look at body weight before exercise, which is 70.5 kilograms. And you're going to subtract the body weight after exercise, which was 68.9. So the overall change in body weight was 1.6 kilograms. You can convert that 1.6 kilograms to grams by multiplying by 1,000, and that's how we get the 1,600 gram change in body weight. Now, to determine the actual amount of sweat loss or the fluids lost, we're going to look at drink volume consumed, so that's 300 milliliters, so that will be added. All right, and then urine volume that was excreted was 100 milliliters, so that was a loss, so that is why that is negative. So 1,600 plus 300 minus 100 gives us a net sweat loss of 1,800 milliliters, or 1.8 liters of fluid during that exercise. Now, the way that we can then determine the sweat rate in terms of milliliters lost per minute, you're going to look at how long the actual exercise time was. So for this particular example, the exercise time was 60 minutes. So during that 60-minute exercise, the net sweat rate per minute was 30 milliliters per minute. And you can figure that out by doing 1800 divided by 60, which will give you that net of 30 milliliters per minute. And like I said, you can do the exact same thing over here with athlete B if you would like. You just need to convert from pounds into ounces to be able to do that. So monitoring hydration status is absolutely critical, and again, because hydration is very individualized, it's important for an athlete or an individual exercising to really be aware of their own hydration level and their own hydration needs. So measuring body weight pre and post workout every day around the same time is a great way to see how much body weight changes and to be able to determine the overall loss. And we'll talk a little bit in briefly the overall guidelines for replacement. Monitoring urine color is another excellent way for monitoring hydration status, particularly looking at color and volume. So the color should be a clear color, as indicated here in this urine chart, 1, 2, and 3. That indicates a nice hydrated status. Now when the urine starts to become more colored, that it really indicates further and further levels of dehydration. Typical amount and timing is also very important, so the athlete really should urinate at least every 2 hours in order to maintain a good hydration status, but also it's important to note the typical amount as well. So we noted before that 3% body weight decline occurs before urine volume really starts to decrease. So we may see a change in color before we notice a change in volume. And so that color change is a really good initial indicator that there's some dehydration going on, and you want to monitor that closely. So we've talked a little bit about dehydration and some of the concerns with dehydration, but there's also some concerns and effects that may occur with hyperhydration. It's generally not a problem and may actually be beneficial to some extent to have a little extra fluid on board. However, excessive hyperhydration can cause significant issues. Of note, hyponatremia or low blood sodium levels. Extensive sweating with only water replacement is a really big concern or high risk factor for developing hyponatremia in these athletes, and it's very common in ultra endurance athletes, those who are, for one, sweating longer because they're exercising for much longer periods of time, but they're also at a higher risk for consuming the additional water and overhydrating in an effort to try to prevent dehydration. The clinical cutoff for serum concentrations of sodium is 135 to 145 millimoles per liter, and then serum that dips below that, 130 to 134, is maybe asymptomatic hyponatremia. Some individuals may not know at all, whereas others may be much more sensitive to it. In a recent Ironman triathlon, about 18% of the competitors were actually hyponatremic after the event, but only a third of them actually exhibited medical problems or symptoms. So again, it can vary from individual. A study that came out excuse me, that evaluated the 2002 Boston Marathon runners. There were 488 who provided some blood samples at the finish line, and of those, 13% were found to be hyponatremic with blood sodium levels less than 135. 0.6% also had critical hyponatremia, or hyponatremia less than 120 millimoles per liter. Now, this is a particular concern because when the blood volume or the blood sodium level reaches that low, that is an extreme risk for brain swelling and for seizures. So hyperhydration is certainly something to be cautious with and to be aware of to help prevent those adverse effects. So we've talked previously on the other slide about some of the risk factors for hyponatremia, but there are also some other risk factors to consider. Slower runners as a whole are going to be at a higher risk for hyponatremia because they're going to be exercising longer and therefore having larger sweat losses or more time to have sweat losses. We mentioned the ultra endurance athletes or any athlete that is exercising for more than 4 hours. Females as a whole are at a higher risk for hyponatremia because they are the ones who tend to be more likely to overhydrate. Individuals who sweat excessively may also be at a higher risk because through that sweating, they may lose excessive sweat losses that way. Those who are unacclimated to heat or poorly trained may also experience more sweating or greater risk for hyponatremia due to that inexperience. And then individuals with just generally inadequate sodium intake, so not eating well prior to the event or not repleting adequately throughout the event. Those are those individuals who are going to be at a higher risk for developing hyponatremia. So I briefly touched on this a minute ago about the symptomatic versus asymptomatic hyponatremia. Some mild symptoms can be some things just as simple as bloating, a little nausea, or mild headache, whereas more severe symptoms may include throbbing headache, vomiting, swollen hands and feet, confusion, and overall disorientation. The advanced symptoms, particularly noted in those with sodium levels around less than 120 or even below that, may experience respiratory arrest, seizures, coma, brain swelling, and even death may occur. So it's something to not take lightly, especially if at a higher risk or an unacclimated athlete. How are fluid needs for athletes estimated? First of all, you want to calculate the daily energy expenditure because fluid needs are based directly on those energy needs. The rule of thumb is 1 milliliter of fluid per calorie expended. So for example, if an athlete has a 3,800 calorie per day energy need, then their baseline fluid need is going to be 3,800 milliliters. Now here we're assuming that those fluids are going to be consumed in both foods and beverages. Remember from our review of the adequate intakes that fluids are generally going to be met about 80% by beverages and the remaining 20% from foods consumed. So we have that 3,800 milliliter baseline fluid need. Then you're going to want to add back the amount of fluid due to sweat losses. And the ACSM A&D guideline is 125 to 150% of the fluid deficit. So in other words, 1.25 to 1.5 liters of fluid per kilogram of weight loss. So I showed you in a couple slides back how to calculate sweat rate of an athlete. So we're going to use that same example that showed the athlete had a 1.6 kilogram weight loss. So in order to calculate then the amount of fluid they would need for repletion, we would take that 1.6 kilograms and multiply by 1.25 and by 1.5. And that gives us a range of about 2 to 2.4 liters of fluid repletion. So that additional 2 liters or 2.4 would be added to the already baseline 3,800 milliliter fluid need. So we've talked a little bit about the general benefit of or the need for monitoring fluid status in ultra endurance athletes, but just endurance athletes as a whole really is a concern for fluid loss. And the reason for that is because the longer the exercise occurs, the greater the risk for fluid loss and the greater the risk for dehydration. Maintenance of hydration is critical for performance, but also for safety. So a way to do this is really to individualize the fluid recommendations by doing sweat trials under different conditions, under different training environments, to really know individually how an athlete may be affected. So at the day of an event, regardless of the environmental situation, they have some background or understanding of how their body will perform under those conditions. Now you can't plan for everything, but certainly practicing different scenarios will help. So now we're going to get into the ACSM and the A&D 2016 guidelines for hydration before, during, and after exercise. Now I want to remind you that the focus of these guidelines is on prevention of dehydration and maintaining a euhydration status. The first guideline is no alcohol the day prior to an event. And although the type, the duration, and the environmental condition of the event should be considered, You need to remember that beyond just the additional calorie load of alcohol, alcohol also suppresses lipid oxidation and can increase unplanned food consumption, which may in turn compromise the achievement of a certain body composition goal. Additionally, the effects of alcohol on strength and performance may persist for several hours even after the signs and symptoms of intoxication or hangover are no longer present. So overall, good general rule of thumb is just avoid alcohol before the event so that you don't have any adverse effects or any lingering signs and symptoms of intoxication. Now, 2 to 4 hours before the event, the athlete should begin drinking about 5 to 10 milliliters of fluid per kilogram of body weight. And this can be water, sports beverages, or a mixture of different fluids. And we'll talk briefly about those in the next slide or so. But the goal here is to maintain that pale yellow urine, a good hydration status, but also that 2 to 4 hour window prior allows for sufficient time to avoid any excess fluid. Some food or beverages that contain sodium in them will also help with some fluid retention to help provide the extra hydration at the beginning of the event. Now, I want to make a note here of hyperhydration. Glycerol and other plasma expanders have been banned by the World Doping Agency. So the only hyperhydration that can occur would be from just simply consuming large amounts of beverages. And we've talked about the risks associated with hyperhydration. So I mentioned on the other slide that we would just review some pre-exercise hydration options. Overall, variety is going to be the best way to go. Choosing things like water, some juices, milk, and sports drinks as tolerated by the athlete. This is totally individualized based on what has been practiced during training and what the individual tolerates. Now, I want to make note that juices should really be consumed in smaller amounts, especially closer to the beginning of the event, because of the reverse osmotic effect that may kind of cause issues with GI upset and diarrhea. Sports drinks are a great option because they contain both carbohydrates as well as some sodium and also providing the hydration before the event. Now, we mentioned on the previous slide about the use of alcohol should be certainly used with caution, generally recommended to avoid. And caffeinated drinks should also be used with caution and should really be individualized. And an athlete who's unacclimated or not used to using caffeinated beverages should absolutely not wait until the day of the event to try one out for the first time because, for one thing, it may cause a diuretic effect, which could really ruin the event for them if they become dehydrated more quickly, but also it may speed things up a little bit and may even cause some diarrhea if not used to it. Carbonated drinks should also be used with caution. These should really only be used in individuals who are used to drinking a carbonated beverage, again, practicing during training, knowing individually what one tolerates. That's the way to go. So during exercise, the goal of hydration here is to prevent excessive dehydration. And excessive dehydration is greater than 2% of total body weight loss. Now, the way to do this is to determine ideal hydration for each individual. And you can do that by doing sweat trials before events during training, exercising under different environmental conditions, under different intensities, to really know individually how much fluid is needed in order to prevent that excessive dehydration. Great options are water and sports beverages. And the consumption rate should be around 0.4 to 0.8 liters per hour. So to put that into practical terms, that's about 3 to 4 ounces every 15 to 20 minutes, beginning at the start of the exercise. And this should, again, be very customized to the individual under the environmental conditions and whatever type of event is going on. Now, if we bump that up to about 7 ounces every 15 to 20 minutes, that's going to be reaching the goal of around 0.8 liters per hour. The 3 to 4 ounces is on the lower end of the range for recommendations. Beverages should be cool, and the reason for that is cold beverages actually empty out of the stomach more quickly than warmer beverages. So you're going to be able to get the fluid into the GI tract much more quickly. However, another reason for the cool beverages is to help overall with the cooling mechanism of the body. That cold beverage helps to cool down the core temperature. Flavored beverages are generally better accepted. They can help the athlete to be able to consume more beverage to maintain hydration. And generally the flavoring helps to avoid GI upset, such as some mild nausea that can occur with water in some individuals. Individual bottles are an option to help monitor intake throughout the event. So every time you have a small bottle, you know exactly how much has been consumed each time the athlete drinks something. Sodium should also be ingested when large sweat sodium losses occur. So this is defined as more than 1.2 liters of sweating per hour. So a way to know that then is if the athlete is losing more than 1.2 kilograms per hour, they have an excessive sweat loss. Now, normal sweat, the normal sodium concentration in sweat is about 1 gram per liter. A way that you can tell individually if an athlete has salty sweat is to wear black clothing during training sessions and see and observe salty crystals that may form on the outside of the clothing. That's a good way to know that the athlete is a particularly salty sweater. Any exercise that goes beyond 2 hours is another reason or another need for sodium to be ingested during the exercise, because as the exercise is prolonged, there's going to be more sweating and more sodium losses because of sweating. So we're going to look now at the post-exercise hydration. Like during the event and prior to the event, we're consuming beverages with the goal of trying to prevent dehydration as much as possible. However, fluids cannot be replaced 100% during periods of heavy sweating because they simply can't absorb the fluids at the rate that they're being utilized. Prolonged intense exercise in hot environmental conditions particularly will produce excessive sweating that just can't be repleted immediately during that period. For that reason, you want to begin rehydrating absolutely as soon as possible. And we talked briefly when we were looking at how to estimate fluid needs that post-exercise, the guideline for repletion is 125 to 150% of the fluid deficit, or 1.25 to 1.5 liters per kilogram of weight loss. Drinks and foods with carbohydrates and sodium are awesome choices because we're going to be helping to get that extra carbohydrate that's going to help with glycogen replacement, but also carbohydrates and sodium work together to help to be absorbed into the gut. And so they're going to be repleting the glycogen, taking the sodium in together, and helping with that absorption of water. There's no sodium restriction post-exercise, and certainly want to plan ahead to have drinks readily available so that immediately at the cessation of exercise, you can begin rehydrating as soon as possible. A good general recommendation from the ACM guidelines is to avoid drinking large quantities in a really short time. So focusing on sipping, but sipping frequently to help get that fluid in. Sipping will help to minimize diuresis and urinary losses, so that the fluid is absorbed and not excreted immediately upon consumption. And as I mentioned a minute ago, carbs help the intestinal uptake of sodium and water, but they also help with glycogen replacement. So we're really achieving 3 different goals here at one time. So I mentioned a couple slides back the need for sodium intake during exercise and after exercise. The sodium and electrolytes that are found in Gatorade and in other sports beverages should certainly be included in rehydration because it helps to enhance the palatability, but also helps promote fluid retention. Therefore, we're holding onto the fluid in order to be able to absorb it better. It also can possibly prevent hyponatremia because of holding on to that fluid and holding on to the extra sodium. The sports drinks do contain smaller amounts of sodium, and they can help promote efficient hydration as well. The goal here or the recommendation for electrolyte intake is about 0.5 to 0.7 grams of sodium per liter of water. Now I want to make note here that that's sodium. Now the way we typically consume our sodium is in sodium chloride, which is about 40% sodium. So if we were consuming sodium chloride in water, in order to achieve that 0.5 to 0.7 grams per liter of sodium, the sodium chloride would be about 1.25 to 1.75 grams per liter. Now, if sodium concentrations decrease in the blood, aldosterone will be secreted from the adrenal gland that will trigger the kidneys to preserve or absorb additional sodium that can then be shuttled back into the blood to increase that serum level of sodium. Sodium from other food sources may also be necessary, though, to correct body fluid and sodium balance. In general, most people, especially in the American diet, consume plenty of sodium in their diet, and foods are naturally have quite a bit of sodium in them. So for the most part, excess sodium or additions generally are not completely necessary. Now, for those who do happen to be particularly salty sweaters, commercial oral rehydration solutions are available. Generally, the sodium concentration of those are about 2 to 5 grams of salt, which is, again, 40% sodium per liter. So that's the equivalent of about 0.8 to 0.2 grams of sodium per liter. So quite a bit saltier than the 0.5 to 0.7 grams recommended above. Generally, this is too salty for the taste preference of most people. To give you a general comparison, Gatorade contains about 450 milligrams of sodium per liter. So it's just under that threshold of that 0.5 to 0.7 gram per liter recommendation. And generally, a lot of people think the sodium taste in Gatorade is pretty prominent. So imagine doubling that, and that's what is in a commercial oral rehydration solution. So I want to touch a little more on just general guidelines and some things to keep in mind about fluids and gastric emptying. I mentioned a couple of these a minute ago, but I want to go in a little more detail. So volume is a consideration when taking in fluids during exercise and post-exercise, because larger volumes overall are actually going to leave the stomach faster to get into the GI tract to be absorbed. Generally, up to about 700 milliliters of fluid will be emptied from the GI tract more quickly. However, again, we think about tolerability issues, and most athletes can't consume that large of an amount all at one time. Also, really large amounts may cause a really big flush of fluid into the gut, which could even contribute to GI distress in the form of diarrhea. So again, the goal, as I mentioned a couple slides back, is to sip frequently, so we're getting enough fluid that we're going to stimulate gastric emptying to help maintain fluid status, but also we're avoiding too large of an amount so that there's not a tolerability issue. And the carbohydrate content is also important. Gastric emptying is going to be slower if carbohydrate concentration of the beverage is greater than 8%. Generally, the recommendation is 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution that offers benefits for both hydration and for carbohydrate fueling. So for the hydration purposes, around 4 to 8% carbohydrate is adequate in order to help promote the absorption of fluids by the small intestines. However, the 6 to 8% range is ideal for hydration as well as carbohydrate fueling post-exercise, particularly when we think about repleting glycogen. Now, when carbohydrate content of any beverage goes beyond 10%, there can be some impaired gastric emptying, which is not going to be a good thing, because then we're kind of doing two negatives here. We're impairing the fluid retention or the fluid resorption, but also not getting that extra carbohydrate to the gut to help with glycogen repletion. Osmolality of fluids and beverages is also going to make a big difference on fluid and gastric emptying. So hypotonic solution polymers may actually empty faster than the stomach than hypertonic solutions. And the temperature, I mentioned this a couple slides back. Cold temperatures or beverages that are a cooler temperature are going to empty more quickly than warmer temperatures. And again, that's going to aid in hydration by getting the water into the small intestine where it can be absorbed. Also helps in maintaining that body temperature. The intensity of the exercise is another contributing factor to gastric emptying. There can actually be some inhibitory effects when the intensity is at around 70 to 75% of VO2 max. And that's really because the blood flow is diverted away from the GI tract to the tissues to really help with the actual performance of the exercise. So we're not going to getting the fluids emptied as quickly. Overall hydration status is another factor that can affect gastric emptying. When hypohydration exceeds 3%, dehydration, then we're looking at some impaired gastric emptying as well that can then cause gastric discomfort and really just exacerbate that hydration issue. So once fluids leave the stomach and get into the small intestine, the water is going to be absorbed by passive diffusion. And the sodium and the glucose will help to promote one another's absorption by drawing water with them via the osmotic effect. And that's another reason why Gatorade and sports beverages are an excellent option for repletion, especially when you've lost sodium as well as fluids, because it's this perfect fuel source that has sodium, glucose, and the water in it. Different forms of carbohydrates will also help promote absorption and get into the gut to help with repletion of glycogen stores. A mixture of glucose, fructose, and polymers rather than just one single form helps to not overburden any one carbohydrate transporter, so all of them are getting transported kind of together. The intensity of the exercise is also going to be one factor that can influence the intestinal absorption. Just like gastric emptying is slowed during really intense exercises, blood flow to the GI tract is also going to be impaired, and so absorption in the gut is also going to be slower during really, really high intensities of exercises. Now, the optimal range for carbohydrate repletion in terms of hydration is 4 to 8%, but I want to make a note here that 6 to 8% carbohydrate solution recommended for glycogen repletion serves a different purpose than this 4 to 8% here. 4 to 8% here is enough carbohydrate to help promote the absorption of fluid into the small intestine. But the 6 to 8% recommendation for glycogen repletion is to provide the carbohydrate fuels to restore glycogen. So staying within that 6 to 8 is a good way to replete both carb stores for glycogen repletion, but also to help with uptake of water to help with rehydration. High concentrations, as I mentioned before, really, really high concentrations of carbohydrate can also cause some pretty severe GI problems, notably the reverse osmotic effect that can cause some pretty bad diarrhea. So on these last couple of slides, I just want to give you some practical guidelines for staying hydrated during exercise. First and foremost, fluids should be readily available. The last thing you want to be doing is scrambling all over the place looking for something to drink when an individual has been exercising intensely and needs something pretty much immediately. And fluids should also be based on personal preference for taste as well as personal experience and knowing exactly what they can tolerate and what they can't tolerate. Now, I know that this is supposed to be a practical guideline. Regular, frequent breaks really need to be allowed as much as possible. And I understand that depending on the sport or depending on the event, sometimes frequent breaks maybe don't occur, but trying to schedule regular breaks as much as possible. Another really good key thing here is to start ingesting fluids very early on during exercise. We mentioned that often the thirst mechanism doesn't kick in until you're already at 1% dehydration, and there's no noticeable decline in urinary output until you've already reached 3% dehydration. So to avoid that extreme dehydration, start ingesting fluids early. Also, have the athlete practice staying hydrated during training, not just during the competition. A couple more practical suggestions I want to provide here is number one, calculate individual needs. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, I want you to remember that we do have great guidelines and overall ranges and goals for maintaining hydration. However, individual needs vary. So it's very important for performance and for safety to really calculate the individual need. Ideal hydration will lead to urination every 2 hours, and the urine should be pale in color. So if the athlete is not urinating every 2 hours, or if the urine is becoming a darker color, that is a very early indication that you need to start getting some extra fluids in order to prevent further decline. Get in fluids daily from a variety of sources and try to keep the fluids cool. Again, that cool fluid will help with gastric emptying and also help with cooling the core body temperature. Now, I know this may not be applicable or practical per se in some events or for some types of exercise, but trying to schedule short breaks for every 15 to 20 minutes if possible. That's another great way to avoid that dehydration. Consume caffeinated beverages only in moderation and only as tolerated by the individual. Again, being cautious to not decide to use a caffeinated beverage for the first time the day of the event. Don't overdo the protein consumption. Overdoing that can cause dehydration because extra fluid is needed to flush out the extra nitrogen from the protein. And lastly, be conscious of the effects of medications on hydration level. You don't want to try a new medication the day before or the day of an event, not knowing exactly how it may affect you, particularly if taking a blood pressure medication or anything that may have a diuretic effect. To conclude my presentation today, I wanted to give you a practice scenario so you can really put these guidelines to practice so you can see how to utilize them. So for this example, we're going to use John, who is a tennis player, who's performing sweat trials during tennis practices to determine his ideal fluid needs in order to prevent dehydration. So his baseline weight is 74.2 kilograms, and we know that his energy needs are about 3,500 calories per day. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions. 1, what is John's baseline fluid need? 2, how much fluid does John need to consume approximately 2 to 4 hours prior to practice in order to help prevent dehydration before the event? And 3, John's post-workout weight was 72.3 kilograms. He drank 350 milliliters and produced 120 milliliters of urine during his 60-minute practice. So from there, I want you to calculate the percentage body weight lost, or how dehydrated he was following his practice. Calculate his sweat rate per minute, and then specify the amount of fluid that he would need to replete the fluid loss during this practice. So I encourage you to stop the presentation now and calculate these out on paper, and then on the next slide, you'll have the answers. At this point, hopefully you've taken the opportunity to review the slides previously and go through the scenario questions that I asked you. So our first question was, what is John's baseline fluid need? We know that baseline fluid needs are based on energy expenditure, and his estimated energy expenditure for the day is 3,500 calories. Therefore, using a rule of thumb, 1 milliliter per calorie, he would need 3,500 milliliters of fluid every day. Question number 2 was, how much fluid does John need to consume approximately 2 to 4 hours prior to practice? The ACSM A&D guideline is 5 to 10 milliliters per kilogram of body weight, 2 to 4 hours prior. And remember again, that's in order to provide a sufficient time to allow for adequate urination but still have enough fluid on board to maintain hydration status during the event. So we use his body weight, which is 74.2 kilograms, and multiply by 5 and 10 to get a range of about 371 to 742 milliliters. Then you can do some quick, simple math, divide that by 30 to get a total number of ounces that he should consume. Question 3 was, John's post-workout weight was 72.3 kilograms. We know he drank 350 milliliters and produced 120 milliliters of urine during the 60-minute practice. So how dehydrated is John following this practice session? Or in other words, what's the percent body weight reduction he experienced? So we take his pre-workout weight, 74.2, subtract the post-workout weight, which was 72.3 kilograms, and he has a net loss of about 1.9 kilograms. Now from there, we just take 1.9 and divide by his previous weight, which was 74.2, and multiply that by 100 to get a percent body weight loss of about 2.6%. And remember, the goal of hydration during the event is to try to prevent dehydration above 2%. So here, John has not met that goal. 3B was to calculate his sweat rate per minute. So we know that he lost 1.9 kilograms over the 60-minute weight loss during the 60-minute period. We can multiply that by 1,000 to get that into grams, so 1,900 grams. We add then the amount of fluid that he consumed during the exercise, 350 milliliters. Subtract the urinary losses, which was 120 milliliters, and we end up with a final 2,130 milliliters of fluid lost, or 2.1 liters of fluid or sweat rate during the 60-minute exercise. You can divide that by minutes to get a 35.5 milliliter per minute sweat rate. Lastly, we wanted to specify the amount of fluid that he would need for rehydration purposes. And again, that guideline is 1.25 to 1.5 liters per kilogram of weight loss. And so we multiply the 1.9 kilogram weight loss by 1.25 and 1.5 to get a range of 3.28 to 2.85 liters fluid rehydration. So this concludes the end of my presentation. Thank you for joining me today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me at the email provided. Thank you.